Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for April 17th, 2020. Today, we're talking about the 10th Amendment and the Virginia Ratifying Convention. There was a lot of opposition and debate over the Constitution there. The principle of delegated and reserved powers, which we understand today as the 10th, was a huge focus at that convention. And I've got a bunch of quotes to back that up from people like James Madison, George Mason, Patrick Henry, Edmund Randolph, and probably a few others. But first of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. You can find all of the previous episode, all of our archives, all of our show notes where I link to important stuff in each episode. All the platforms we're on, whether it's video, live streaming, archive, audio-only podcast edition, ways to follow us like our email newsletter, our social media platforms. And you can even find ways to support us like our membership program, which starts out as little as $2 a month. We make it go a long, long way when a lot of people chip in and help us out. I'm so very grateful for that. Find all of that information and more over on the show homepage over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. That's all spelled out. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I'm so very grateful for you spending some time with me today. I hope you are as happy, as healthy, as safe, and as stocked up as can be, but I promise to not take up too much of your time since it's Fast Friday. Let's see if I can get to this in about 10 to 15 minutes. First of all, in my last episode, which I recommend you check out if you haven't yet, it's long, maybe even take a look one more time, the 10th Amendment, an introduction. I spent a lot of time talking about how many state ratifying conventions basically flipped from opposition to the Constitution to supporting it as long as they could recommend amendments. And chief among them, and in many states, primarily Massachusetts, where I focused a lot of my attention, the first thing that they recommended was what became the 10th. I kind of glossed over a little bit on Virginia. It's almost as important. I think Massachusetts to me was so important because it was so early on, and a lot of other states followed the lead of people like John Hancock, Samuel Adams, and Theophilus Parsons. But Virginia was incredibly important talking about these principles of delegated and reserved powers. So as we get into this one more time, let's read the 10th Amendment. It's 28 words. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. And in this episode, I'm primarily covering a 3-part article from T.J. Martinell. I got to reach out to him and see if we can turn this into an ebook because it's so good, called The Virginia Ratifying Convention and the Birth of the 10th Amendment. And he starts it out like this. At the convention, many aspects of the Constitution, such as the power of taxation, were thoroughly discussed and debated. However, those who helped craft the Constitution, as well as its supporters, also made it unmistakably clear, if approved, the Constitution would set up a limited government with only certain specific powers delegated to it, powers that could be taken back if desired. And he sums it up. He's got this important point in here that I mentioned in the last episode. To grasp the significance of what was said during the Virginia Ratifying Convention, it is critical to first understand the importance of the people there. Among the delegates, and this is not an exhaustive list, this is a huge list of big names from the founding generation, were James Madison, Edmund Randolph, John Marshall, Patrick Henry, and George Mason. And you don't have to agree with any or all of them, but just understand that the weight that they held at that time is a big deal. So let's start out with George Nicholas. And he was specifically talking about delegated and reserved powers. He said, should the federal government exercise any power not vested in them, it will be a usurpation of the rights of the different state legislatures. Remember, I've talked about on this show, if you've watched it in the past, usurpation is something that's seen as a theft of power. The term means government stealing power that isn't authorized to it. And since this is setting up a system of the people being sovereign for the first time in history, the people of the several states hold sovereignty or final authority. When government does that, that's a big problem. But George Mason wasn't necessarily convinced that the way the Constitution was drafted without amendments would be acceptable. And he put it this way. He says, I hope that a government may be framed which may suit us, by drawing a line between the general, that's the federal government, the general and state governments. And they called it a general government because it only exercised very general powers and very specific. Everything else was reserved to the people of the states to determine how they would do it, whether they would have their own government on a state level or a local level, or if they'd let the market deal with something. So he says they want a line between the general and state governments and prevent that dangerous clashing of interest and power. So Mason was very concerned. This was a high priority for George Mason to make sure that there was a very express delegation of power, and reserved powers was everything else. James Madison followed up talking about this as well. He says the powers of the federal government are enumerated. It can only operate in certain cases. It has legislative powers on defined and limited objects, beyond which it cannot extend its jurisdiction. Now, if you've recognized this, or if you've read the Federalist Papers, or if you've heard about this, this is very similar to what he said in Federalist 45, supporting supporting ratification in New York to the people of New York. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution are few and defined. Those reserved to the states are numerous and indefinite. Now, no one knew Madison wrote that till a few years later. He wrote that in secret and published under the name Publius, along with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. But this is the same type of argument he's making here in Virginia. Legislative powers on defined and limited objects. Richard Henry Lee said something very similar as well. He said in the federal government, the rulers of the people were vested with certain defined powers, and that what were not delegated to those rulers were retained by the people. And Edmund Randolph, who was the governor of Virginia, very prominent, very well known, very highly respected, even from people who didn't agree with him. He says, every power not given it by this system, and he's talking about the federal government, is left with the states. So the people who were supporting the Constitution, people who were influential in its drafting, passage, and things like that, and advocating for it, they were pointing out over and over that even before the 10th Amendment existed, mind you, this is in the summer of 1788, even before there was any 10th Amendment ever even drafted, before there was a Constitution, the general document itself was one of expressly delegated powers. And here's George Nicholas one more time, and he made it very clear. He says, it is a principle universally agreed upon. No one disagreed with this. In fact, there was no debate about this principle. He says that all powers not given are retained. It is a principle universally agreed upon that all powers not given are retained. That's got to be one of my favorite from the whole Virginia Ratifying Convention. There's a lot from Patrick Henry that I think is really good. And in fact, Patrick Henry wasn't convinced. He thought a lot of the clauses would be misconstrued. He thought that they would be read expansively, and he understood this idea of delegated and reserved powers, but he was still concerned overall. And George Mason backed him up. He hammered away, TJ writes, for the need for a clause that says, quote, with respect to all powers which are not granted, that they are retained by the states. And George Nicholas followed up that pretty quickly with something that I guess would be a precursor to nullification. He says, look, if they exceed these powers, for those of you who are concerned about the limitation of powers, the delegated and reserved powers, if they exceed these powers in Washington or in the federal government, the general government, the people will have a right to declare it void. Not the courts, not the Congress itself, but the people will have a right to declare it void. And that's why I think it's a powerful precursor to nullification. Now, Patrick Henry, again, he was really concerned that all the other nations, and this is the way he put it, all the other nations basically took the opposite construction. They viewed the law or constitutions, they viewed the idea completely the other way around. He says all nations have adopted this construction that all rights not expressly and unequivocally reserved to the people are impliedly and incidentally relinquished to rulers as necessarily inseparable from the delegated powers. And that's why he and Mason were pushing for what eventually became the 10th Amendment, because they're saying, look, if we don't really just make this clear, rulers are going to come in, politicians, governments in the future are going to come in and say, well, you didn't say it was expressly reserved to the states or the people, so we can do whatever we think is necessary to carry this stuff out. And he was very, very concerned about that. Now, Edmund Randolph again stepped in and he says, look, in the general constitution, the powers of the federal government are enumerated. Is it not then fairly deducible that it has no power but what is expressly given it? For if its powers were general, an enumeration would be needless. And he's explaining, like, look, this is kind of pointless. We don't need to have this added in here because there's no point in enumerating powers if you think that they can just do whatever they want. They just had a general police power, you might want to call it. But Henry Mason and others really won the day. They debated with Edmund Randolph, and they actually convinced him otherwise. They're like, look, you gotta flip the switch on this. And that's what TJ actually summed it up as. He said the disagreement over the meaning of the Constitution would persist for the duration of the convention. Finally, George Mason and Patrick Henry's insistence won over Edmund Randolph, who admitted there was no reason to exclude a Bill of Rights. A lot of people were basically arguing, saying it was superfluous. We don't have to include this. And here's how Edmund Randolph put it. He says, if in the ratification we put words to this purpose, and that all authority not given is retained by the people and may be resumed when perverted to their oppression, and that no right can be canceled, abridged, or restrained by the Congress or any officer of the United States. If we include that, he says, I say if we do this, I conceive that as this style of ratification would manifest the principles on which Virginia adopted it, we should be at liberty to consider as a violation of the Constitution every exercise of a power not expressly delegated therein. I see no objection to this. So Randolph, after some extensive debate and some convincing by Patrick Henry and George Mason, was convinced that, look, we should include this in our ratification to say that all powers not expressly delegated are retained. And that was a huge turning point because it may have, I think Randolph had a big part in actually getting it passed in Virginia. Now, mind you, when it came down to the end, George Mason and Patrick Henry still opposed. They voted no. And I think they wanted to say, look, we either have to have another convention, we need to include these amendments right now, things like that. They didn't want just a recommendation because, and Patrick Henry talked about this in the Virginia Ratifying Convention itself, June 6th or June 8th, somewhere around there. He said, look, if we just trust that they're going to do the right thing, when does that ever happen without a subsequent loss of liberty? So he was concerned that they wouldn't add a Bill of Rights to actually hammer it home. But in the final vote, it actually passed. And the ratification document included this statement that the people of Virginia, and this is really good stuff, I think, declare and make known that the powers granted under the Constitution being derived from the people be resumed by them whensoever the same shall be perverted to their injury or oppression. So again, this is focusing on the sovereignty of the people having final authority, that if they delegate power, since they're sovereign, they can choose to take that power back. And they go on, they say that every power not granted thereby remains with them and at their will. And so then they included recommendations. After they had that statement, they included recommendations for a Bill of Rights and then a number of amendments to the body of the Constitution. In most other states, primarily Massachusetts and elsewhere, they recommended amendments, not specifically in the body or in a Bill of Rights. They definitely wanted a Bill of Rights. But a lot of places, like Massachusetts, for example, wanted the first amendment in the Bill of Rights to be what became the 10th Amendment. But in Virginia, they wanted a Bill of Rights separately, and then in the body of the document itself, they wanted this amendment, quote, that each state in the Union shall respectively retain every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this Constitution delegated to the Congress of the United States or to the departments of the federal government. And that really was a precursor to the 10th Amendment, just like the ones suggested in New Hampshire, in Massachusetts, and elsewhere. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope you found it educational. That's most important. I hope you learned something. I really appreciate you spending some time with me on this Fast Friday edition. I apologize if I went a little over time, but some really important stuff. I have a number of other episodes I'm going to probably do in the near future, explaining in more detail other aspects or parts of the history behind the 10th Amendment. If you've got any ideas or recommendations on this or on other episodes, feel free to leave it in the comments. I will check that out later today or tomorrow over the weekend. Or feel free to email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. That's all spelled out, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. If you support the show, there's a lot of free things that you can do to help us out. Smash the like button, subscribe, get notifications, leave reviews on podcast platforms, iTunes, Spotify, elsewhere. Reviews and feedback on the podcast platforms really do help a lot because it tells the platform to show the program to more people. Same with on the video platforms as well. So thank you very much for that. And if you really want to kick in and support us financially, we can certainly use your help. The membership program starts out as little as $2 a month. I'm stumbling over that. I apologize. $2 a month. We've got annual programs, lifetime, 5-year, all kinds of stuff. Check it out over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, I'm very grateful for you spending some time with me today. Again, I hope you are safe, healthy, happy, stocked up, as good as possible on all those counts. I hope you have a good weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.